Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another amazing Office of Human Rights and Equity Lunch and Learn. I promise another gripping, awesome topic that's going to rock your soul, heart, and mind this afternoon. But first, let me tell you a little bit about our office and myself. My name is Marla Moore, and I'm so happy to be an outreach coordinator with the Office of Human Rights and Equity because we seek to eradicate discrimination, increase equal opportunity, and we protect and promote the human rights of all county residents. We serve as a catalyst in fostering attitudes and beliefs that confirm that every individual has the opportunity to enjoy a wholesome and productive quality of life, and that you can pursue a life free from discrimination. And we do this by three different units. One is the outreach unit where we do trainings, workshops, events like this. Then there's the investigative unit where we investigate complaints of discrimination for all the protected classes in Howard County. And the last is our equity unit where we are doing equity surveys and making sure that we have that kind of inclusion, diversity, equity, and justice for all county residents. So I'm going to talk about our guest right now for a minute. Dr. Kelly Clark is the regional trustee of North America for Report Out, an international NGO that focuses on queering human rights and international development. She works tirelessly to educate and collaborate with nonprofits in the United States and Canada. Dr. Clark serves as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Howard County Library System, where she leads equity and anti racism efforts. With 30 years of experience as a social justice educator, Dr. Clark is an expert in LGBTQIA plus competence and masculinity as it relates to homo and transphobia. Dr. Clark's work with the LGBTQIA victims of violence and discrimination fueled her passion for developing and leading countless trainings, many geared toward ending violence against the LGBTQIA plus community. Dr. Clark earned her doctorate in executive leadership from St. John's Fisher University. She also holds a BA in psychology and an MA in counseling and human development from the University of Rochester.
Thank you so much, Marla. It's great to be with you.
Yes, Dr. Clark, I'm so super excited because when you sent me this report, call to action, a crisis of queer invisibility, climate change as a risk multiplier for LGBTQI people, I was like, whoa, it was enlightening. It was terrifying for one reason. In the past government situations that we've had, there's been a lot of false news about the impact of climate change for every community. People are like, that's not a thing, right? The earth is just going to do what it's going to do. But the deal is, history has shown us already that if white cisgender community is experiencing a storm, the same storm has the repercussions of like a tsunami in marginalized communities.
Yes.
Yes, yes. So, to quote former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth. These are one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortage, global health, food security. These are solutions to one problem that must be the solution to all. Dr. Clark, I just can't wait to hear more about your work with Report Out and this compelling study.
Marla, thank you again for that wonderful introduction. And I appreciate the invitation to share more with your wider audience. And I would agree with you. This report was a little frightening, right? And
Yeah.
so, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a little bit of a primer. I think we need to back up just a bit before talking about um, the effects of climate change, specifically on LGBTQ, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about other marginalized communities as well. I think we need to kind of back up and take a look at, so what is climate change? What is it that we already know? And that's the way in which our report was written. So I will go ahead and ask for the slides to start, and we'll do a little bit of a primer. And then we're going to come back and actually have a conversation, a deeper conversation about then the impacts in these vulnerable communities. So thanks so much, and go ahead to the next slide. I just want to give a shout out to the report's authors. So I am a member of the board for this international organization called Report Out. We are a global human rights organization, and you see organization is spelled strangely for us here in the US because this organization is actually located in the United Kingdom. And so, although we are based in the UK, it is a global organization, and we use our research, things like producing this report, to help inform the public, to educate others, and to campaign about human rights as they relate specifically to LGBTQ folks around the globe. And go ahead to the next slide. I want to shout out to the author of our report, Elliot Hatt, who is an independent research consultant with us. And Elliot spent a good year and a half on this report. And I want to just talk a little bit about how it was put together. He really did a wonderful deep dive into the existing literature. So, really great literature review. What is it that we already know? Not so much about climate change in and of itself. This is not a report about the scientific nature of climate change. This is a report about the human impact, right? So, what do we already know about the human impact of climate change? And one of the things that he found was that there's not a lot that's been written about LGBTQ folks and climate change. And so he also did an original research project with this report, sent out a survey worldwide through some of our channels with folks that we work with at Report Out, asking LGBTQ people specifically what their experience has already been with climate change. And so we have both this rich deep dive into the literature as well as some independent original research that was done. So I'd like to just send a shout out to Elliot for the work that he's able to do. And we're going to give you links to the report so that you can read it in full as we go along here today. Next slide. So in 2015, former High Commissioner of Human Rights, Mary Robinson, described climate change as probably the greatest human rights challenge of the 21st century. Okay, that sounds ominous, but what does that actually mean, right? What does it mean that the climate on our globe changing is going to affect the human rights that each of us have? I think it's harder for us here in the United States to think about it in this way because we really do not have a history of learning about human rights in the US. So even though our own First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a significant player in the establishment of the United Nations and in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, most Americans don't have a clue as to what human rights really are. Go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start by let's have a little primer about human rights. And then we'll kind of speed back up to talk about how all of this affects LGBTQ people. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1948. And this part is the preamble, right? What it says is we're all born free and equal. Everyone is entitled to these rights no matter your race, religion, sex, language, nationality. Everyone has a right to life, freedom, and safety. No one can take your rights away. They are indivisible from you as a human by virtue of the fact that you were born. You have the responsibility to respect the rights of others. Here in the United States, we learn about civil rights. That's the frame through which we often see social justice issues, right? We know that we've had waves of civil rights. From women's suffrage to African American civil rights to Latino rights with Cesar Chavez to um, some of the Native American rights that we're seeing right now, as well as LGBTQ people and even people with disabilities. A civil right really is a right that's codified by your nation state, right? It is a law that's where the civil part comes in. So all of those fights that we've had throughout American history have been people asking government to please pass a law that clarifies our protection, right? That is not what human rights are at all. Human rights are not given by any state, not given through any government action. The United Nations intended for these rights to be thought of as rights that are simply ours by virtue of the fact that we are alive. And so that all states, no matter where you live around the world, should respect these human rights that are primary even before our civil rights, right? So let's go to the next slide. So there are 30 articles within the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but let's just pick out a few to talk about. So, right, no one has the right to hold you in slavery. This is where we get the thought that human trafficking is wrong, correct? No one has the right to torture you. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Think about what that means. That means that everyone should have the right to be connected to their own nation state, right? And we have so many conflicts around the world that sever those ties for trivial reasons. Everyone has the right to belong to a religion of their choosing. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Here are the other 15, right? So everyone has the right to gather in a peaceful assembly. We have the right to leisure and rest from work. You cannot be held in servitude for hours and hours and days on end without having an opportunity to rest. Every adult has the right to a fair wage. Everyone has the right to an education. So these are what we call our human rights. So if we think about what Mary Robinson was saying, she was saying that the fact that climate is changing around the globe is one of the number one um, challenges to people having these rights and being able to have them remain intact. And so that's what this report really talks about is then how do we look at climate change? How do we look at people who are sexual and gender minoritized communities and how their right to all of these can be affected? One of the things that we already know is as marginalized people, lots of folks around the world don't even have these rights guaranteed by their government. And so, in a climate emergency, how much worse is this going to get? Is really what this report is about. Go on to the next slide. So, the Human Rights Council in 2021, and then again the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2022, said that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was recognized as a human right. But it stopped short of placing any kind of obligation or responsibility on states around the world to actually tackle climate change. So we feel like it makes sense. We should all have access to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. How do we get there is the challenge. And, honestly, as I was preparing for today and really digesting this report in an even deeper way, it occurred to me that we have been hearing from lots of climate researchers about what's going on with our actual planet. What I don't think we've done is to hear from enough social scientists about how those physical changes in the planet are actually going to manifest themselves in our day-to-day lives. And so I'm really excited again to be able to present this information because that's what we're going to do today. So let's go to the next slide and start taking a look at what this report really begins to offer. So extreme climate conditions, we already know this because we're living through some of this already, right? We're having extreme temperatures in terms of our heat. We're having precipitation that just comes and comes and comes. It's coming in different places from what we're used to having. We're having droughts in places that have never seen drought before. Extensive fires, extensive flooding, tornadoes, cyclones, hurricanes. Cyclones and hurricanes are basically the same thing. They're just called different depending on which ocean you're living next to, right? And so we know that we're seeing an increase in frequency and an increase in the extremes of weather. Next slide. So, what are the impacts then? We can talk about the impacts of this. So, there are direct impacts. If you think about weather being directly impacted to ecosystems, so how is the physical planet being directly impacted? We've got damage and irreversible losses to ecosystems. Our ecosystems are deteriorating. We've got structure, function, resilience, and adaptive capacity that is changing. So we think about what we would call the barrier islands along the southern eastern United States. New Orleans, other parts of coming up the coast have more capacity for extreme impact to those landscapes because some of the barrier islands have now been destroyed. Those islands that were protecting the mainland, right? So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. We have changes to our ocean environments. We have shifts with our seasonal timing. I know those people who are my age, kind of your late 50s and 60s and 70s, um, are always talking about how it seems like the climate is the seasons are different. Like winter used to start here and go to here. Now it's changed, right? We've got that going on. Species and habitats are being affected. Species are moving more towards the poles. So that band around the equator that is heating up, is driving species as well as humans kind of further and further away. And then, of course, we've got significant injury, death, including mass mortality events and species extinctions that are happening around the globe currently. Next slide. So, then what are the indirect impacts? So, we've got these things that are happening to humans. Severe respiratory conditions like asthma are acting up. We've got increased admissions in hospitals due to heat related stress and respiratory illness. We've got increase in disease transmission rates. So, thinking about food, water, and vector borne illnesses increasing in frequency. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but we think about something like COVID 19 and we're not necessarily thinking about it as part of our climate emergency, but there is real evidence that would suggest that the increase in worldwide endemics and pandemics has something to do with the way in which our climate is shifting. Next slide, please. What are the things that we may not think about in terms of the effects of climate change around our psycho and social emotional impacts, right? We have very clear evidence that women and sexual minorities are at greater risk for domestic and interpersonal violence due to a changing climate. So think about it. The stress that people can be under in a drought, the stress that people can be under in an extreme heat emergency, longer, many more days in summer that have that irritable heat that we're just living through, right? Think about the amount of stress that people endure when they're going through an actual crisis like a hurricane. And then think about the prolonged stress that people have following um, these the impact of the original event, but then we've got to live through now how that event has impacted our lives. So there's lots of data out there that suggests that women and sexual minorities are being at greater risk for that kind of harm. Then there's worsening mental health. So we've got simple, I shouldn't call them simple, but things that make sense, right? You lose sleep during a heat wave, we become irritable and we may have a lower cognitive function because of many days of less sleep due to our sleep being interrupted by heat. That's an example. But we also have severe conditions that are also worsening, right? People who are enduring stress and PTSD following extreme weather crisis that they're living through, whether it's running from a fire, losing everything to a flood, or losing everything to a hurricane, even losing loved ones to, think about the stress that would have been caused by an event like Katrina or Sandy or Ida, right? Next slide, please. So then think about what we also are beginning to see, I think, in a lot of our youth, which is being named climate anxiety. It's this prolonged phenomenon of people just experiencing these levels of anxiety, hopelessness, anger, grief, and that is this existential dread that is happening particularly in our young folks, because these are the folks who understand it's like, where's my future? What's happening? Right? And so they're thinking, I want to plan for the future, but I don't know what the planet is going to look like. Do I want to have children? Those conversations that people typically would have had in the past. Oh, I'm going to have so many children and this is what my life is going to be. And I'm going to, I'm going to college and I'm doing all these things. And this level of existential dread that doesn't even allow some of our young people to dream in that way anymore. And then some serious social and emotional impacts we're beginning to see, which is evidence of increased suicide rates. So one of the things that we can see a correlation among is higher temperatures, with some studies suggesting that every time we have a 1% degree increase, we've got a 1% increase in suicide rates, right? So that is just with regard to higher temperatures, but think about with regard to the frequency of storms that are coming now. We barely have time to recover from one before the next thing is hitting us. And recovery from storms isn't just within, the first several months of a storm. Think about entire communities recovering. How long did it take for New Orleans to actually recover from Katrina, right? That's a 5, 10 year, decade long process of whole communities and neighborhoods and cities recovering before the next one is right back to kind of undo all of the things that we just did. And so this level of suicide and anxiety is also on the rise. Next slide, please. And so if we look at displacement impacts, which is probably the number one thing that people may think of when we think of climate emergencies, right? People running for their lives, people having to leave, people's homes being destroyed, tornadoes, right? We've just seen a number of tornado events throughout the central United States. Between 2009 and 2019, there were an average of 21.5 million displacements worldwide caused by weather events. That's more than double what is caused by conflict. And so when we turn on the radio, when we turn on the TV, we hear a lot about refugees running from conflict, but we're not necessarily thinking that there are so many, exponentially more people who are leaving home because they have been displaced due to some type of extreme weather event. And we have people who are permanent refugees, right? Those are people who are needing to move from places that are really no longer permanently inhabitable. And while that's happening around the world, communities, especially communities along the coast here in the US, are beginning to think about, does it make sense for us to continue to rebuild every year? Because this may become part of the US that just is uninhabitable because of the intensity of storms that we're seeing and the frequency that we're seeing these storms. So there's some estimates that we could have over 1 billion people worldwide by 2050 seeking permanent refuge from places that are no longer inhabitable by humans in the world, right? If we think about what this looks like for the US Census did something that was really smart. Last year in 2022, they actually asked people, what has been your experience with displacement due to the impacts of climate change? And what they found was truly shocking to them as well as other researchers across the country. 3.4 million American adults said that they were displaced, right, because of climate change. That's almost 1.5% of the entire US population. And if we look a little bit deeper, 40% of those people were able to return home within a week of evacuating, which is great. But that means that 60% of us here in the United States, I'm not talking about other parts of the world, but 60% of us here in the United States actually could not go home. And 12% were out of their home for more than 6 months. And 16% were people who were never able to return home. And so if we think about what's happening around the world, beginning to look at what's happening right here at the US, in the US, we're already beginning to see the effects of climate change and how it's affecting people. The next slide. So if we think about those 3.4 million people, here are some of the demographics that I think are really interesting for us to look at. Those earning less than $25,000 a year had the highest rate of evacuation of any economic group. People making over $200,000 a year was a tiny fraction of people who actually had to evacuate their homes. I don't know what the cause and effect of that is. This is a report that just came out, and so it needs much more for us to look at it, but we're beginning to see. So, what is that? Where are people living? Um, what are the structures that they're living in? What are the areas that they're living in that would cause that level of devastation to have a difference with regard to our income? We know that gay, lesbian, transgender people had a much higher evacuation rate than people who identify as straight or cisgender. And that these are actual numbers from 2022. The evacuation rate for people who are divorced or separated was twice as high as the rate for married people. Again, don't know what that's about, but it's an interesting fact that um, social scientists who are interested in the human impact or the impact on humans of climate change need to take a deeper look at, right? And then we know that Black and Hispanic residents in this particular study from the US Census Department had slightly higher evacuation rates than white residents. So when we think about what displacement really then means to people, it means an interruption in work. Think about, I want you to really just kind of close your eyes and think about if I had to pick up and leave today and I couldn't come back for a week, for 2 weeks, for 6 months, what would that do to me? If I lost my job in that particular instance, then I have no ability to be in a hotel, right? If I am already under $25,000 per year, I have no resources to go live in a hotel for a number of weeks or months, right? People may have water insecurity because I may not have actually evacuated or been displaced, but the water's off and I don't have anything appropriate to drink. There may be political and demographic tensions that then begin to happen. Think about Katrina and how many people left New Orleans to go to most people went into Mississippi, lots of people went into Texas, and think about those places having to absorb new residents who may be temporary, who may be permanent, but who are devastated and traumatized because of this disaster. And so the political and the economic and the social and cultural ability for folks who are in safer zones here in the US, which I might add, Maryland is one of them, to be able to absorb different kinds of people coming in, particularly with the rate of, um, I wouldn't say mental illness, but the effects on mental health of those refugees from climate change and how we can receive them, right? So it's really important for us as social scientists, people who are interested in social justice work, to think about all of these. Think about the levels of homelessness. So, homelessness becomes both a potential consequence of a climate disaster as well as a risk factor, right? People who are already homeless, what do they do in a climate emergency? What does a homeless person do in an extreme cold emergency or an extreme heat emergency? Or where does someone who is homeless evacuate to when the tornado warnings go off, right? But it also is then a consequence of climate change because people are leaving their homes and may be homeless after um, after their displacement. So that is what our deep dive into the existing literature had to share with us. And this last bit about the US I added in. And if you're interested in these particular numbers, you can go to the US Census Department to see that report. If we can go to the next slide. What I'd like to do now is kind of switch gears, and I want to bring Marla back and move into a conversation about how these things that I've just kind of set the stage for this little tutorial really begin then to impact LGBTQ people, as well as folks who are also in other marginalized communities. So welcome back, Marla. Thanks for thanks for being.
I'm stricken and I have thoughts about all the things, Dr. Clark, but I just really want to amplify some of the things you said.
Okay.
And let's talk about those numbers. But first, let me just mention county residents, HOCO,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So we have about 50% of the of people, residents are like house poor, right? Which means you
Yes.
might be able to afford your rent, ooh, which is really it's one of the more expensive places to live in the US overall.
Hmm.
But I know that as a person who's just working my little trying to be middle class life, I can't afford like this winter. I don't want to use dangerous space heaters in my apartment, but it's cold. And then when it's
Yes.
hot, we're like opening windows and trying. So imagine these astronomical electric bills where people cannot afford to seek the shelter they need for the heat of cold or cold. There are residents who have died of heat stroke
Yes.
or cold, right, in
Yes.
their homes during the winter,
Yes.
trying
Well,
or a burn down, space heater causes a fire. People are trying to do
right.
the best they can, but
Yes, and we have to think about when I say mass death events, I'm not just talking about species, right?
right.
There was a heat wave through Europe in 2003, I want to say, and there were 70,000 deaths
Oof.
across the continent that were attributed directly to that particular heat wave. So we're not just talking about, oh, isn't it sad that, this particular species of squirrel is not going to be around
Right.
anymore. No, this is really affecting how we as average people are living our lives. And so let's start by talking about the fact that LGBTQ identities know no boundaries. And what I
Exactly.
mean by that is you will find people who identify within the LGBTQIA plus spectrum from age 5 to age 105. You will find them in every demographic of what we would call race, nationality, ethnicity, language, heritage, religion. And so when we think about how LGBTQ identities compound how people may fare in a climate emergency, we've got to think about people at the intersections, right?
Yes.
Every economic, strata, you're going to find people. And so when we think about, you want to bring up this thought about Howard County, I've got a statistic right in front of me. So I'm looking at the ACE's self-sufficiency report that just came out for 2022. And if we're looking at the income below the poverty level. So, of all of the people in Howard County whose income is below the national poverty level, 40% of those people identify as Black or African American, right? So, think about the fact that I just showed that people who were under $25,000 a year had the highest rates of evacuation, right? If you add marginalized LGBTQ identities on top of race and income, then you have people who are really marginalized in our society. And those are the folks who will experience this, what we're calling this kind of exponential, right? This multiplication or multiplier factor. So think about the fact that I may identify as, let's say I identify as a Black transgender woman who is retirement age 63, right? I've been underemployed my whole life because people won't employ me because I'm trans, because I'm Black, right? I was kicked out of school as a young person because I didn't fit the mold and so bullied out. And so I never even went to college, barely finished high school. So I'm underemployed for a number of reasons, right? I'm already on the edges, marginalized in society. I certainly am looked at differently because of my age now, because people don't think that I can contribute as much to society. And here comes a climate emergency. all of those intersecting marginalized identities make it that much harder for that person to survive in a way that is healthy and thriving.
And we have an abundance of LGBTQIA community, particularly trans, that experience homelessness because their parents
Already.
and institutions kicked them out. So you
Exactly.
already don't have a place to live, and the
Right.
problem is exacerbated. And the other thing
Right.
that's really interesting, you mentioned NOLA, right? So we can look at primarily Black people and how I want to call that a genocide, okay? Because the
Mm,
storm was one thing, but the reaction of our government at the time was akin to let's just eradicate a whole bunch of people from this particular situation. Now, NOLA, and the Gulf Coast regions, they've never come back. So there's children who were placed maybe in social services or other families, so they've lost their families. We've lost culture, we've lost music, we've lost grandma's recipes, we've lost identity, and
yeah.
we've lost history. The same
Right.
impact is the LGBTQIA community because they've got history, they've got culture. Every different sect, every different way to be
Right.
LGBTQIA has history, culture, contributions to society that must be passed on. And also sometimes because they don't have birth family acceptance,
Exactly.
they have an intrinsic, like a family, a made family pieced together of
Yes.
sojourners. And when you separate people, right, who are already experiencing these things, what do we lose? Think of all the cultural contributions
Right.
that we will lose.
Well, and just think about the broad cultural contributions, but also let's zoom in on something that you just talked about, which is our family of choice.
Yes.
Um, Family dynamics again are a risk factor and multiplier here, because there are some folks who are living with family that is not accepting and doing the best they can working to get themselves out of that situation. And that happens especially in rural communities where the access to transportation, the access to um, really having larger communities where I can get to know people who are more like myself than in my small town of 2,000 people, 10,000 people, right? In a climate emergency, am I having to stick with these people for safety because of the climate, even though I personally feel unsafe with these folks due to my identities, right? So I
Mhm.
may make a choice to stay in an unsafe situation because I need them for cover because there's safety in numbers from this climate emergency that we're going. And the opposite is then true. Somebody who has already left, who is now facing a climate emergency, where do they go? Lots of folks, when they have to evacuate, the government says, hey, evacuate, hurricane's coming, you've got 5 days to leave here. People are calling family and friends in other states and other places to say, hey, can I stay with you? Can we do this? Can we do that? If I have a community of people, my family of choice, we're all living here together. All of us have been estranged from our families. We are not calling people in our family to say, hey, can I bunk with you for the next week while the storm blows over, right? So, just that individual set of circumstances, if we're all in it together, then we're losing something there. I want to bring up the notion because I think it's really important for us to understand a continuum of violence that is happening currently right now in our culture, and that has to do with a lot of the anti-LGBTQ laws that are being passed. Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, 23, 25 states, maybe even more than that right now, currently have some type of legislation pending that is going to affect the ability of transgender Americans to live their lives. This started a year or two ago with the way in which families could seek gender affirming care for minor children, right? But it is now slipped into having adults, full adult people in Florida come July will no longer be able to seek gender affirming care within the state of Florida. Doctors won't be able to prescribe it based on fear of being arrested and prosecuted, and insurance companies won't cover it based on the fear of what the Florida government is doing. So even here in our own country, we have people who are being criminalized for who they are, talk about genocide. What happens if I'm a trans person who lives in Florida and as of July can no longer receive medical attention? What does that do to me, especially if I'm a person who is already underemployed, undereducated? I can't leave because I don't have the resources to leave, but I can't stay the way I am. And you're going to force me to experience medical symptoms because you're the government and you say so, right? So I want to think about what our legislators are doing, because when you say to someone, you can't read, Julie has two dads, it's not just the effect of banning the book. It's the effect of saying to everyone in your community, something about that is wrong. It's bad. It's grooming children, right? That is the very beginning of the violence that will happen, because what happens is, think about Katrina. What happened? People who could get to the stadium went to the stadium. The stadium was complete chaos, right? No toilet tissue, no food, no sanitary products, complete chaos.
Think of the prisoners. Think of
Or
those in
think of the
hospitals.
prisoners. Right,
Think of all those people who
right.
died.
So now if we're in that stadium and I'm Julie with my two dads, how am I being treated? How are my dads being treated? Do my dads separate and don't and pretend that they're not together because they know that in the state of Florida, this is the people are all wound up
And they're armed.
around
And they're
LGBTQ people,
armed.
and
And
they're armed because
right.
we have created situations where in Florida anybody can walk around with a gun. It doesn't have to be registered. You don't have to have any permits. It's just yours, right? And do I risk having my daughter taken away from us because somebody sees our daughter with two dads and says, "Oh no, this is wrong." And so now somebody within this has martialized themselves to be the person to say, "Oh, you can't be here with these men." Right. And so I want us to really understand the impact of what these state jurisdictions are doing as they're passing these laws. A transgender child cannot play baseball with the other children at 10 years old, at 14 years old. That's a law that is supposedly going to protect somebody. I don't know who, but that attitude is what creates the propensity for violence. And when we are already stressed in a climate urgency or emergency, that's when all the ugliness between humans is going to come out, right? And so it's so important for us to not just hear these things and go, "Oh, I guess that makes sense." No, we have to think about what the implications really are across time. I want to talk about health for a minute. I know we don't have too much more time left, but let's talk about the fact that a 2018 survey found that 52% of LGBTQ people had experienced depression within the last year, and 13% of LGBTQ folks between the ages of 18 and 24 had actually made an attempt of suicide, right? We hear that just rising temperatures is exacerbating the potential for suicide. And then we have a group of people who already have a significant level of depression and suicidation. We bring those two sets together and we have the perfect storm for folks really not being able to have the level of support that they need. And I might add that if we think about what happened, I mean, this is not a natural disaster, but it paints the picture of how LGBTQ people are treated in disaster. If we look at the 9/11 and what happened with so many people losing their lives across the country in that, there were LGBTQ couples in New York who were able to apply for um, what would have eventually, what would, for all intents and purposes, been spousal um, benefits due to the impact, right? So the government set up something for victims' families. Victims were able to say, "Hey, even though we weren't married, we have a long-term relationship." And New York said, "Okay, that's great." Virginia did not. So when we were looking at the people who were affected by the Pentagon, disaster, we had folks who maybe have been living together their whole lives, 15, 20, 30 years together, owning homes and properties and all of that, right? Who were ineligible based on government, right, procedures to be able to get any support. And so when we think about the fact that the Supreme Court has just kind of released some of this stuff back to the states, Roe v. Wade was much more than just about abortion, right? It was about states' rights. And so the right to privacy, Roe v. Wade basically eliminated, and the fact that states can make this up, there's not a federal right for this, means that all of the things that we're seeing in the states right now individually are causing what's going to eventually be, or currently is, a patchwork of laws across the country that are going to differentially treat LGBTQ people as they're seeking support and
There's
services.
50 different Americas, right?
50
That
different
that's the
Americas.
best way to explain it. If you can
Yes.
afford to be in a good part, that's tolerant, that's green, you might be okay. But
Yes.
even then, when you talk about a crisis, you're also talking about who can be in that hospital. Many of us have experienced COVID, and we know that no one can visit you, right? Because
That's
that's
right.
just what it is. But just imagine the impact of somebody needing treatment and
Yes.
their loved ones not being
Yes.
able to be with them, to attend them,
Right.
okay, to be allowed to give them the care they need that would keep them alive.
Yes. And that happens a lot with
Yes.
LGBTQ elderly,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because people from, so if we think about our Stonewall generation, right, these are people who were
Um,
18, 19, 17 in 1970, 69 when Stonewall riots happened, right? There are older elders now. A lot of them were disenfranchised, kicked out by families. They
right.
built their own communities and families of choice, but that meant they were all aging together. Well, they are they are twice less likely to have adult children to help participate in their care. And so if you think about who is going to hold my hand and be by my side, it's going to be other people who are my age,
Right.
because I don't necessarily have children. I don't have relatives. I don't have nieces and nephews who are looking out for me. And so the people that you made as your family are not your next of kin. They can't get into the hospital. They have no rights to even claim your body if something should happen to
Right.
you in a climate emergency, right? And so yeah, there was a lot here. And I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. It's really great that climate scientists have been telling us to look at this. And a lot of people look at it and they're like, okay, yeah, it looks like the weather is getting worse. We need to have a call for social scientists to come and talk about the human toll that this weather pattern is going to begin to, or it's already having on us, because I think that like this conversation today has been hard, some really hard, ugly truth. Like you said, it's terrifying, but it is necessary to get our attention, because just the climate scientists ringing the bell is not doing enough for us. We need to have these hard conversations to look at what this means. And so every other even though the report out report is about LGBTQIA plus people, every other marginalized community is going to be dealing with everything that we have talked about today. And so here is one of the, I think climate also can not only be the great multiplier, but it can be the great equalizer, in that all
Yes.
marginalized communities are going to be in this together. And this might be the thing that gets us to coalesce around a common cause that allows us to put down some of our differences. Like, you don't do it the way I do it, right? Put down those differences, because all of us, from people who are making very limited income to folks who identify as trans, and everybody in between, people within the disability rights movement, all of us are going to be in the same boat with regard to climate change.
It is so true. I was just going to say, I know you probably heard this if you look at some financial advisor stuff, because it's this crazy America bootstrap mentality that should be buried and taken off of life support,
Yes.
whatever. Is one, most people don't have 6 months of emergency funds saved.
Oh, no, who has that?
Who has that? Most people don't have like a shelter in their basement or whatever. If you've got a basement where you've got six
If you
months
have
of
a
non
basement.
perishable food and a water supply, are you really that off the grid? grid? And if you are off the grid, can you be certain that where your little grid is not going to be affected by Mother Nature? No, you
You
cannot.
can.
And so
And
my
one of
thing,
the things that
yes,
we should think about for Howard County is the number of apartment communities that we have
yes,
here, right? Those people could be in, um, you know, some level of danger because of just so much apartments, as opposed to what you're saying is individual and safe dwellings that might be safer in a climate emergency. I have to admit, though, Howard County, as I looked and did a little bit of research, is not really prone to a lot of climate emergency. So we
yes,
happen to be in a fairly good part of the country. The hurricanes don't quite make it all the way
right.
inland, and the flooding that we have is, yes, severe, and that's flooding is probably the number one climate emergency that we are prone to. It is fairly localized. I think the challenge that climate change is going to present for Howard County and, maybe for LGBTQ people in Howard County is people look from Delaware and other parts up and down the coast
Okay.
looking to us as a refugee community, right? So those people who are facing displacement, remember only 40% of people were able to go back after a week. Those folks that we surveyed, right, last year. So 60% of people were someplace longer than a week.
Mm,
People are coming in perhaps to Howard County as a place to get away from. I mean, even Baltimore, with the tidal basin in Baltimore, may be a place that is more vulnerable than we are here. So people leaving those areas, how is Howard County prepared to support folks? And do we have particularly LGBTQ identified people, people who identify as Black, people who identify as Native, people who identify as living with a disability, right? Are those people involved in conversations with county officials, with state officials who are responsible for climate emergencies so that their understanding, needs, and perspectives are included in our disaster planning? Which brings me to the last slide. So let's go ahead and pull that up because I have the call to action that I think is important up for people, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to share some of the other good stuff that's going on with regard to Earth Day this year. So here are just four. Our report has dozens of recommendations, but here are just four that I pulled out that I think are important. So adopting anti-discrimination and hate crimes laws, which include sexual orientation and gender identity. Quite frankly, our country is going in the opposite. Let's make sure that Howard County and Maryland stay in the positive of protecting LGBTQ folks, because again, continuum of violence, if we've got these protections, it not only says you're protected, but it says to everybody else, hey, these are valued members of our community, right? Provide funding for LGBTQ community projects, centers, networks. Let's increase the amount of connectivity that people have. Reduce isolation is going to be able to support us as we begin to have to make some shifts due to climate emergencies. Adopt a queer, inclusive, disaster prepared policies, which is what I was saying. We need to have people who have voices at the table. um, Honestly, it cannot just be middle-aged, middle-class white men running our disaster prepared areas of government. We've got to have a multiplicity of voices to be able to, have a preparation plan that doesn't look like what happened with Katrina, right? And then we need to all take political action to ensure that we are electing officials who understand what is going on. The fact that we were brought out of the Paris Accords for climate change by the last administration should be troubling to every American. With this level of severe impact already happened. What I talked about today was not future. If you look at what people are talking about in the future, it's quite apocalyptic, right? To have us not even sitting at the table with other nation governments to talk about climate change is really sinful. And so that is on us as people who vote, to vote in the kinds of folks who are going to take this seriously. And then my last slide, please, just shares with you again where to get the report. Please take a picture of the QR code. You can send me a note if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the work of Report Out. I am looking for North American based organizations to partner with. So that's the US and Canada. Even though Mexico is part of North America, we are including Mexico in Latin America due to just language so we can have all of the Spanish speaking region together. So I am the Report Out trustee for North America. And I would love to talk to anyone here in Howard County or across the country or even in Canada about how you might partner with Report Out to do a little bit more of a human rights frame here in the United States as we're talking about LGBTQ rights.
Dr. Clark, I am still blown away. I want to thank you for spending this afternoon with us. And I just want to remind you that the same people who are after the LGBTQIA community and don't want them to have their rights are the same people who don't go for religious freedom, for
Right.
disability rights, for women's rights, for rights of religion, nationality, age, all the things.
And
So
there's so
this,
much more of us than them.
right, that's it. There's more of us. We should all be allies and friends. Doesn't matter if you quote unquote love your neighbor, but if you love this planet and may enjoy living in the house, the state, the county that you live in, just think of old Ellicott City, for instance, and the flooding that has
Yes.
happened there. Think of
Yeah.
the fires that we're having right now in certain parts of Maryland, right? It is real. It is urgent. Mother Earth is asking for you, for us to come together as people that want to live and want our children to live and their children to thrive. It's not too late for us to answer the call. Dr. Clark, again, thank you. And look, you can count on me to spread the word. And speaking of spreading the word, we are putting on an amazing Earth Day celebration on Sunday at the Harriet Tubman Cultural Center from 11 to 2. I'm going to look at my list and just give you a few of the goodies because we've got goodies for people of all ages. We've got a healthy cooking demonstration where you can sample Caribbean food with Althea Hansen of Althea's Almost Famous. We have an introduction to gardening. We've got our Howard County Master Gardeners. We've got, oh my gosh, we've got food distribution from from Community Action Council and Columbia Community Care. We have the NAACP, the Roving Radish talking about food justice. We have crafts and healthy food initiatives for children. It's going to be an amazing day. So I want you all to come out because you can learn how to garden, whether you have a balcony or a community plot, or you have a kitchen and you want to grow herbs, whether you want to know more about what can I do to have food sustainability and agricultural justice in my county. Please come join us. It's free of charge, as are all of our OHR events. And once again, thank you for sharing this fabulous afternoon. And it is in our hands to protect the earth, but we've got a mighty group of hands and we can do it.